The author of the James Bond novels was Ian Fleming. And he came from a wealthy family connected to a merchant bank called Robert Fleming and Company. His father was a member of parliament until his death on the Western Front in 1917. The family sent Ian to the establishment schools, Eton, Sandhurst, and so on, but he never really succeeded. He never really cared for a whole lot except for women and drinking. So his family tried different things. They got him to the universities of Munich and Geneva, where he did a lot of skiing, a lot of drinking, and chasing women. Ian moved through several jobs before he started writing. And this bank that he's connected to through his family was quite successful, was sold to Chase Manhattan for over $7 billion in the year 2000. So he never really had to try. And his brother was successful. His father was dead because he died in the war, and the mother was very controlling. And the family business was started with the manufacturing of fabrics for sandbags in the American Civil War, and it became an investment tool with the headquarters in London. Then he got into the railroad business, thus tying the family to the American establishment, and you know, this connection will become much more important later on. First school that Ian Fleming went to was Durnford School, a preparatory school on the Isle of Purbeck in Dorset. And this was not a happy time. Food was lousy, the physical hardship was lousy, the bullying was horrible. And of course this is British tradition, and even at these better schools, for people with a lot of money, the kids get treated pretty harshly, and that has a very important reason. You know, this harsh treatment is supposed to bring out antisocial traits, narcissistic traits, because the British establishment cannot continue and renew itself if the offspring, if the new children in the upper class and upper middle class, if they are too soft and they're too nice and so on. And that left its marks. He tried Eton College, was not an achiever, and then he got into trouble with his housemaster at Eton, so didn't like his attitude and so on. So the mother of Fleming was persuaded to remove him from Eton. Then they tried a short stint at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. Was there for less than a year, didn't get any commission, and he contracted a sexually transmitted disease. So, his mother wanted him to go to the Foreign Office and of course become powerful in the establishment and continue the success of the family. But that didn't work out. The mother sent him to Austria, private school run by a former British spy called Ernan Forbes Dennis. So he improved his language skills, did a lot of skiing. That's why the James Bond character likes to ski, or, well, there's a lot of skiing in the movies, and lots of fancy locations, fancy European and international locations. Of course, that's what Ian Fleming could afford, while many other people could not afford. He applied for entry to the Foreign Office but failed the examinations, and that's something that occurred many times. He failed and he failed and he failed, and the establishment didn't really want him because he wasn't really qualified for anything. And the mother again intervened, and she tried, and she was lobbying Sir Roderick Jones, head of Reuters news agency, and she was successful. Her son was given a position as a sub-editor and journalist for the company. Isn't it funny how this all ties together? You know, this aristocrats like Sir Roderick Jones running the news agencies. And this is a common theme. This is one crowd running news agencies, running the espionage business, running the empire, and so on. you will see a lot more of these connections later. So, running entertainment, running news, running the empire, running the espionage. He spent some time in Moscow, covered a Stalinist show trial, applied for an interview with the dictator, and he only got a signed note that this meeting was not going to happen. Then the family of Ian Fleming wanted him to get into banking, so they got him a position where he was completely unsuccessful. He also tried to be a stockbroker, was unsuccessful. So he had lots of affairs. He was having an affair with a woman who was married to a baron. And this woman, she had an affair with somebody else, with the heir to Lord Rothermere, owner of the Daily Mail. Again, news media, entertainment media, and aristocrats. Finally, his calling came. Ian Fleming was recruited into the Navy. He became the personal assistant to Rear Admiral John Godfrey, Director of Naval Intelligence. Which was odd, because Fleming had no real experience as a spy. Now, of course, when he went to Russia as a quote-unquote journalist, there are suspicions that he was already training as a spy. You know, he was kind of doing the legwork necessary to earn the trust of his superiors, to kind of get respect in the intelligence business. So, that might have happened, but still, being a little spy, you know, pseudo-journalist, you know, that's not really qualifying you to move into an important position in naval intelligence. But still, somehow, maybe with the help of his family, he got that position. Even Fleming's biographer Andrew Lycett notes that Fleming had no obvious qualifications for the role. And Ian Fleming never became a James Bond type character. He was never a field agent, never a superstar, never a soldier like this. But he was a guy who did a lot of the talking between different government agencies, did some liaison with the Americans, what later became the CIA. He was kind of sort of involved in that a little bit. And he was selecting targets with other people. So he was sitting in a room and looking at, you know, different targets on a map in Europe and choosing and picking targets for special forces who were operating during World War II in Europe. So, not even the special forces guys liked Fleming because they thought, you know, what does he know? And he called them Red Indians, and that was not very, very professional. The whole working relationship was not very professional at all. And his superior, Rear Admiral John Godfrey, he was kind of a difficult person too. He wasn't very popular, so he let Ian Fleming do a lot of the talking. And Godfrey made a lot of enemies within government circles. So Ian Fleming was going back and forth between the government's wartime administration, secret intelligence service, political warfare executive, special operations executive, joint intelligence committee, and the prime minister's staff. He devised a lot of ploys and plots against the German, but nothing really good. A lot of outrageous ideas, and Fleming also met with Colonel Wild Bill Donovan, was President Franklin Roosevelt's special representative on intelligence cooperation between London and Washington. And Fleming went to the United States and kind of co-wrote a blueprint for the OSS, which later became the CIA. And if you know the history of the CIA, they didn't have a clue about spying at all. They were just copying the British model of special operations, and in the first years, the CIA basically was dominated by this concept of training these little groups and sending them into this Cold War. And most of the times this failed because the Russians had infiltrated Western intelligence, and so the Russians always knew what was coming, they knew the operations, and most of these CIA operations failed. Fleming was put in charge of Operation GoldenEye between 1941 and 42. GoldenEye, of course, the name of a famous Bond movie, and I think also a Bond novel. So he was supposed to prepare an intelligence network in Spain in the case the Nazis invaded Spain and controlled Spain at a later point. Then you had all this special forces, commando stuff, the 30 Assault Unit, the T-Force, Target Force, chasing documents, doing stuff, assassinations, the whole bit. And Fleming sat on a committee that selected the targets for the T-Force unit. They listed them in the black books that were issued to the unit's officers. So these T-Force guys, they did a lot of these famous operations, discovering Nazi rockets and other experimental research, experimental weapons. Some of that stuff made its way into the Bond novels, especially Moonraker. And a lot of these classic Bond villains were Nazis or former Nazis, closet Nazis. In 1942, he decided on living in Jamaica, and after the war, he lived there for a long time. Then he went back and forth, working as a journalist again, and then writing Bond novels during, I think, the winter months. So that was his workflow. So he was not involved anymore in the Cold War, like he was involved in the Second World War. You know, that's kind of funny and probably due to his meager performance. But then he wrote these novels, the James Bond novels. So he wrote these things, and initially the reaction was pretty lukewarm. People said, you know, this isn't really good, it doesn't have any suspense, and not really interesting. But then it became a small success in Britain. And then he received a lot of help in the United States. So again, this crossbreeding, this help, because he used to be a spy. Fleming used to be the liaison between the Brits and the American intelligence agencies. So the Americans helped him with his novels. Life magazine gave Fleming a big boost by publishing a story saying that President Kennedy liked the James Bond novels, was among Kennedy's 10 favorite books. Kennedy and Fleming, they met in Washington earlier. So that kind of publicity, that artificial publicity in that advertisement made Bond very popular in the United States. And he kept writing these novels, obviously to advertise for the intelligence world and to make people want to become an agent, even though the job was really different and it's depicted in the novels. And also, it was supposed to tell especially the Brits, yeah, the old empire, the old British Empire is gone, but it's now more covert. We have covert methods of maintaining the empire. So it was supposed to be this message for the audience. Fleming was a heavy smoker, heavy drinker, and he didn't live very long because of that. It was part of his ideology, kind of his life outlook. You know, he was rather a brightly burning candle, and he said, I want to be blazing and then die instead of having a dull life, a dull, long life. So that was his idea. And then the movies came along. The movie rights were sold, and then you had these Hollywood producers, and it's also very interesting. Responsible for the movies were Harry Saltzman and Albert Broccoli. They formed Eon Productions, and that production company is still around. They still make Bond movies, especially the new one, Spectre, is done by Eon. Even famous author Umberto Eco noted many things about the Bond series, so a lot of really scientific-minded people and you know, really respected people started commenting on this Bond stuff, and they really liked it, and they said, oh, this has a certain formula. The Bond villains, they tend to come from Central Europe, Slavic or Mediterranean countries, have a mixed heritage and complex and obscure origins. The villains were generally asexual or homosexual, inventive, organizationally astute, and wealthy. So even today, this is the same formula in the new Spectre movie that just came out or will come out soon. You have Christoph Waltz, I believe, playing the evil Mr. Oberhauser, you know, the Austrian actor, and you know, the whole bit. So classic Bond villain stuff. And the last villain in Skyfall, he was kind of homosexual. Famous scene between Daniel Craig and Javier Bardem, where he's touching Bond's knee and all that sort of stuff. So it's the same formula again and again and again and again. Yeah, and lots of throwbacks to this World War II sphere, kind of these villains. They're villains like Graf Hugo von der Drache, Drax, German Nazi masquerading as an English gentleman, Hammerstein, former Gestapo officer in For Your Eyes Only, and on and on and on. So, the real British Empire, or the visible British Empire, was in decline, especially after the war. A lot of rationing austerity was taking place, and so people liked the fantasy of Bond fighting for the Empire, and even though Bond in the novels, he doesn't make a lot of money while working for the intelligence service, but during his missions, during his work, he has unlimited funds at his disposal, or virtually unlimited spending power. So, the formula is always the same. The head of MI6, called M, gives Bond a mission. Bond meets the villain, meets the Bond girl. There's a back and forth. Bond gets captured. He gets tortured. He escapes, kills the villain, and, you know, rides off into the sunset with a Bond girl. And there's always a secret super organization. It's kind of its own player in this East-West conflict, even kind of Illuminati style, playing these both sides against each other. So Bond is, in certain ways, like the author Ian Fleming. A womanizer, traveling through Europe, heavy drinker, heavy smoker. In the novels, Bond is a heavy smoker. In a single novel, Bond consumes wines, different wines, champagne, whiskey, bourbon, soda, scotches, whiskey, vodka, martinis, brandies, schnapps, gin, German beer, so he's a super heavy drinker. But Bond's performance is never affected by this. In the novels, James Bond even sometimes takes amphetamines to boost his performance. Now, in the movies, so you had producers Albert Broccoli and the other guy, Albert Broccoli. Hang on a second, I'm confusing the names here. Albert Broccoli and the other guy, Herschel Saltzman. Now, Mr. Broccoli was a big producer, big-time guy, and made most of his movies in the United Kingdom, Pinewood Studios, and they made Bond these big, spectacular movies. And Broccoli was born in New York City, came from Italy, kind of this Calabria region, and his cousin supposedly was a mobster, Pat DiCicco, and this is an interesting connection because the CIA had a working relationship, or maybe still has, probably still has, working relationship with the Italian mafia in the US and in Italy, especially in the south of Italy. So the Gladio program was tied to the south of Italy. There were training facilities and so on. So and then you have ties to the Vatican and all these different venues. Really, really interesting. So again, spies, mafia, CIA, entertainment industry, psychological warfare, and aristocracy. Now this Pat DiCicco guy, he kind of the cousin of this movie Bond producer. DiCicco married Gloria Vanderbilt, the famous robber baron family Vanderbilt. Again, tying into the establishment of America. Gloria Vanderbilt, she went to Hollywood. She married DiCicco, and he was abusive, and supposedly was beating her a lot. And at some point, DiCicco was beating up a comedian who then died. And then there was a divorce, but Gloria Vanderbilt is a member of the Vanderbilt family of New York and the mother of CNN television anchor Anderson Cooper. I mean, how crazy is that, right? So you get like this, just again, like Ian Fleming got his job at Reuters, which was headed by an aristocrat, and then, of course, you have here the mob, and you have the Bond movie producers, and the mother of CNN television anchor Anderson Cooper. And then we have Herschel Saltzman, better known as Harry Saltzman, because, of course, a lot of people didn't want to hear Jewish names, or they kind of wanted to hide that, so they called him Harry. And Herschel Harry Saltzman, he once enlisted with the Royal Canadian Air Force in British Columbia, which, of course, well, Canada is part of the British Empire. So, again, tying into all this, into this establishment, he was serving in the Canadian Army in France, received a medical discharge in Ontario, and then joined the United States Psychological Warfare Bureau because he wanted to get back into the action, get back to Europe. Isn't that interesting? So a guy who fought in the war for, for Canada, for the big British Empire, the Commonwealth, then goes into psychological warfare, then goes into the entertainment industry and becomes a producer of the James Bond movies based on the novels by a former British guy who selected Special Forces mission targets. It's just totally crazy. So, and then you have all this talk about esoteric, occult elements in the James Bond novels and the movies. Especially Freemasonic symbolism and all that. And certain people, they have looked at this and written books about them. Most books about this are kind of boring. I've looked at them. And so, there's a lot of material that, yes, Ian Fleming was interested in Aleister Crowley, Dr. John Dee. He was reading a biography of John Dee while he was writing the first Bond novel. And there are certain interesting parallels between Ian Fleming and Aleister Crowley. Both of them had an espionage background. They were interested in the occult, and they were hedonistic. Drugs, alcohol, women, and so forth, and all this clad into an occult system, justifying this kind of thinking and lifestyle. So James Bond is a modern knight fighting these super villains, and that kind of ties into, the classic occult Hollywood and the fantasy genre. Now, of course, Bond is not exactly the same as Harry Potter or The Matrix or Star Wars, which is always the same kind of story. The obscure, frustrated, unhappy protagonist is plucked from obscurity, plucked from his boring life, meaningless life, meets a fantasy creature, supernatural creature, gets introduced into this new fancy schmancy esoteric world where he learns the magic, he learns his craft, becomes a master of the craft, joins this guerrilla war, and then is victorious over the big enemies and so on. So it's not exactly the same, but it kind of ties into that, because the Bond novels and the Bond movies, they're exaggerated, they're fancy. The villains are somewhat larger than life, and what Bond does is larger than life. And he was a guy, an unhappy family situation, and he gets plucked from obscurity by the MI6, and he becomes a superhero in his own right while he's on the job, and fighting these super villains, and always coming out on top, drinking like a sailor, but never being in trouble because of that, never underperforming because of that. So that is James Bond. So here you have it. Here you have it, a world-famous franchise that ties into an establishment that treats its own offspring pretty badly, to bring out the bad traits and to keep this empire going, keep this elite going the way it's been going so far. And it's an establishment that's controlling entertainment, that's controlling the espionage, that's controlling the news industry, the news business, and it's rewarding loyalty, and it's choosing loyalty over talent in many, many ways. So enjoy your Bond movies, have fun while you watch them, but of course be well aware of what it is, and look for subliminal messages. Look for these interesting little tidbits about the intelligence agencies, the propaganda placement, the advertisement for intelligence agencies, and so on. And many people have argued that political correctness has sort of neutered James Bond, because in the Pierce Brosnan Bonds, in the Pierce Brosnan era of Bond movies, suddenly Bond had a female head of MI6, and he wasn't allowed to basically hit women, his Bond girls, any longer, and so on. But even in the earliest Bond novels, you had pretty strong Bond girls. They're either intelligence agents or law enforcement, or they're successful syndicate leading criminals. So even in the 50s and 60s, where feminism really wasn't a big thing, he kind of portrayed this kind of superwoman, this kind of super Bond girl, or this kind of thing. So that's something that is consistent through the different years, and is consistent even today. We hear a lot about the new Spectre Bond movie, the new Bond girls, and supposedly they're fighting just as much as he is, and they're sometimes even they are as good as he is, and they sometimes even surpass him. It's all part of this esoteric union between the male and the female, and then of course they need to have sex, and Bond is part of this whole union. Remember, in the first Daniel Craig Bond, Casino Royale, in the novel, Vesper Lind was a Russian agent, and then she fell in love with Bond, but she still kind of betrayed him, but then she betrayed her own people, she betrayed the Russians, and that's why she got killed. So Bond, she's not a fighter like Bond, she's not suave and a fighter like him, but she still fools him. So she's on his level. And in the movie, they changed her to a quantum agent, an asset of the group Quantum. But still, she fools Bond, and she betrays Bond, and so we see them, they are on an eye-to-eye level. So this is the fancy, really crazy background of the Bond franchise.